Ethan Marlowe had spent 3 years learning to be both mother and father to his son, and he thought he had made peace with the quiet that filled his house every evening after supper. He ran the family ranch alone now, ever since his wife Clara had passed from a fever that took her too fast for goodbyes to feel finished. His son, Noah, was 4 years old, with his mother's soft brown eyes and Ethan's stubborn chin, and together they moved through their days in a rhythm built entirely on necessity. Ethan fed the cattle before sunrise, cooked breakfast one-handed while Noah tugged at his sleeve, and fell into bed each night too tired to feel the full weight of his loneliness. He told himself that was enough. He told himself a man could live a whole life on routine and duty, without ever needing more. Then, one ordinary Tuesday in late autumn, he rode into town for supplies and saw her standing outside the general store, and the years fell away as if they had never passed at all. Her name was Margaret Hale, though back when he'd known her, she'd still been Margaret Ashford, a preacher's daughter with a laugh that used to carry across the schoolyard like sunlight breaking through clouds. They had been sweethearts once, 17 and foolish and certain that nothing could ever come between them. But her father had taken a post 2 counties over, and Ethan had been too proud and too poor to ask her to stay, and too young to understand that some regrets never fully fade. They simply wait, patient as winter, for the right moment to surface again. Margaret looked different now. There was a quiet weight in the way she held herself, a stillness that hadn't been there in her youth. Her dress was simple gray wool, plain and unadorned, and there was no ring on her finger, though a thin band of pale skin at her knuckle told him one had been there once. When their eyes met across the dusty street, Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, something he thought had gone cold and buried long ago. "Ethan Marlowe," she said, and her voice still carried that same warmth, though tempered now with something heavier. "I heard you were still out at the old Marlowe place." "Margaret!" He removed his hat, suddenly aware of how rough his hands looked, how weathered his face had become. "I didn't know you were back in these parts." "My husband passed 2 winters ago," she said simply, without asking for pity, only stating a fact she had long since learned to carry. "I came back because my mother needed help, and because I didn't know where else to go." There was a silence between them then, full of everything unsaid, 3 years of marriage and loss compressed into a handful of words. Ethan wanted to say something comforting, something that might ease the grief still etched faintly around her eyes. But before he could find the words, Noah came barreling out of the store with a peppermint stick in his fist, nearly colliding with Margaret's skirts. "Whoa there, partner," Ethan said, catching his son by the shoulder. Margaret knelt down, unbothered by the dust on her hem, and smiled at the boy with a gentleness that made something ache deep in Ethan's chest. "And who is this fine young man?" "This is Noah," Ethan said. "My son." "He has your eyes," Margaret said, looking up at Ethan, though they both knew that wasn't quite true. Noah's eyes were Clara's, soft brown pools that reminded Ethan daily of the wife he'd lost. But he understood what Margaret meant. There was something of him in the boy, in the way Noah held his chin, in his stubborn refusal to be hurried. They talked a while longer, standing there in the street while the autumn wind stirred the dust around their boots, and by the time Ethan finally loaded his supplies onto the wagon and turned toward home, something had rekindled in him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He told himself it was nothing more than the comfort of an old friendship rediscovered. But that night, lying awake long after Noah had fallen asleep, he found himself thinking of Margaret's eyes, and the sad, steady strength in them, and wondering what it might be like to see her again. He didn't have to wonder long. Fate, or perhaps simple small-town circumstance, brought them together again within the week, when Margaret began helping at the schoolhouse where Noah would soon be old enough to attend. She started walking the same road Ethan traveled each morning to deliver milk to the general store, and though neither of them spoke of it aloud, their paths began to cross with a regularity too consistent to be entirely accidental. Margaret was different now than the girl he remembered, softened by grief but not broken by it, carrying herself with a quiet resilience that Ethan found himself admiring more each time they spoke. She asked after Noah with genuine warmth, and slowly, cautiously, she began to ask after Ethan too, about the ranch, about Clara, about the long nights he spent alone trying to be enough for a boy who deserved more than one exhausted parent could give. "It's hard," Ethan admitted one afternoon, as they sat on the porch of the Hale farmhouse while Margaret's mother dozed inside and Noah chased chickens through the yard. "Harder than I let on to most folks. I love that boy more than my own life, but some days I don't know if I'm doing right by him." A boy needs more than a tired father who falls asleep in his boots. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching Noah's small figure dart across the yard, his laughter ringing bright in the cool air. "Grief doesn't leave much room for anything else," she said finally. "I know that better than most. When my husband died, I thought the sadness would swallow me whole. Some days it still does. But then I remember that grief isn't meant to be a life sentence. It's meant to teach us how much we're capable of loving, so that when the chance comes again, we recognize it." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt the years between them collapse into nothing. "Do you think we get chances like that twice?" he asked quietly. Margaret met his gaze, steady and unflinching despite the vulnerability in her voice. "I think some people are lucky enough to find their way back to what they lost," she said. "I think maybe that's what happened to us." Neither of them said more that day, but something had shifted, some quiet acknowledgement passing between them that neither was ready to name. Over the following weeks, their meetings grew more frequent, more intentional, though always cloaked in the practical excuses of small-town life. Margaret would bring over preserves for Noah, insisting they were simply extra from her mother's pantry. Ethan would find reasons to pass by the Hale farm on his errands, telling himself it was simply the most convenient route into town. Noah, meanwhile, had taken to Margaret with the easy, uncomplicated affection only children possess. He would run to greet her whenever she visited, showing her his collection of smooth river stones or the wooden horse Ethan had carved for him the previous winter. Margaret always knelt to his level, listened with genuine attention, and something about watching her with his son made Ethan's chest tighten with a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Clara's passing. Winter descended early that year, blanketing the valley in an unforgiving cold that made the isolation of ranch life feel sharper than usual. Ethan found himself struggling more than he cared to admit, juggling the demands of the cattle with Noah's needs, exhaustion wearing him down to something thin and frayed. It was Margaret who noticed first, arriving one bitter morning to find Ethan attempting to mend a fence with Noah bundled against his chest in a sling, the boy's small face red from the cold, both of them clearly miserable. "This is madness," she said without preamble, climbing down from her wagon and marching toward them with a determination that brooked no argument. "Give me that boy before he catches his death, and you go finish your work properly." Ethan handed Noah over without protest, too tired to argue, and watched as Margaret carried his son into the warmth of the house, murmuring softly to him as she went. When Ethan finished his chores an hour later and came inside, he found Noah asleep by the fire, wrapped in a quilt, while Margaret sat nearby mending a tear in one of Ethan's shirts. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though gratitude softened his words. "I know," Margaret replied, not looking up from her needlework. "But someone has to look after the both of you, and it seems no one else has volunteered for the job." Ethan sat down heavily in the chair across from her, studying her face in the firelight, the gentle lines that grief and time had etched there, the steady competence in her hands as she worked the needle through worn fabric. "Margaret," he said slowly, "what are we doing here?" She finally looked up, and there was no pretense left in her expression, only honest uncertainty. "I don't rightly know," she admitted. "I only know that these past weeks have been the first time since my husband passed that I've felt like myself again. And I think, perhaps, you might feel something similar." "I do," Ethan said, the words coming easier than he expected. "I've felt it since that first day outside the store. I thought I'd buried all that a long time ago, back when your father moved you away. I told myself it was foolish to still carry a torch for a girl I hadn't seen in 15 years. But then there you were, and it was like no time had passed at all." Margaret set down her needlework, her hands folding together in her lap. "I thought about you often, over the years," she confessed. "More than I probably should have, given that I was a married woman. I wondered what became of you, whether you'd found happiness. When I heard about Clara, my heart broke for you, even as I was ashamed of the small, selfish part of me that wondered if perhaps fate was giving us another chance." The fire crackled between them, and Noah stirred slightly in his sleep but did not wake. Ethan reached across the small distance separating their chairs and took Margaret's hand in his, feeling the roughness of years of hard work against his palm, and something in him settled, like a door long stuck finally easing open. "I don't want to rush into anything," he said carefully. "Not when Noah's happiness depends on the choices I make." But I also don't want to let fear keep me from something that feels this right. Margaret's fingers tightened around his. Then let's not rush, she said. Let's simply see where this leads, one honest day at a time. And so they did. Through the remainder of that hard winter, Margaret became a steady presence in Ethan and Noah's life, first as a friend, then gradually as something more tender and enduring. She taught Noah his letters by the fireside while Ethan worked on mending harnesses, and slowly, without any grand declaration, she began staying later into the evenings, until eventually she was staying through supper, and then through the putting Noah to bed ritual he so loved, until it seemed strange for her not to be there at all. Spring came, and with it a softening of the hard frost that had gripped both the land and Ethan's guarded heart. The ranch came alive again with the business of calving season, and Margaret proved herself as capable with livestock as she was with mending and cooking, surprising Ethan with a competence he hadn't anticipated but came to rely on more each day. Noah, now 5, had taken to calling her Miss Margaret, with such affection that it made Ethan's throat tighten every time he heard it. It was on a warm evening in late April, with the sun setting gold over the mountains and Noah playing in the yard with a new puppy Margaret had brought him, that she finally said the words that would change the course of their lives. They were standing together on the porch, watching Noah's small figure chase after the puppy through the tall spring grass, and Margaret's hand found Ethan's without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other. "Ethan," she said softly, "I've been thinking about what you said, back in the winter, about not knowing if you're doing right by that boy alone. I don't think you have to be alone anymore. Not if you don't want to be. You and your boy need a home, a real home, with someone who loves you both enough to stay through every hard season and every good one after. I love you, Ethan Marlowe. I think I never stopped, not really, not even during all those years apart. And I love that boy as if he were my own. I want to build something lasting with the both of you, if you'll have me." Ethan turned to face her fully, his heart full to bursting with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years, not since before Clara's passing, perhaps not even then with such overwhelming certainty. "Margaret Hale," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "I have loved you since we were young enough not to understand what love truly meant, and I have loved you all over again these past months in a way I understand completely now. There is nothing that would make me happier than for you to become part of this family, truly and permanently. Will you marry me?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though her smile was radiant even through them. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married that summer, in a simple ceremony at the little church where Margaret's father had once preached, surrounded by neighbors who had watched their quiet courtship unfold with warm approval. Noah stood beside his father, dressed in his best clothes, beaming with the uncomplicated joy of a child who understood only that his family was growing, that the woman he loved was now going to stay forever. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for ranch life never offered an easy road, but they faced each difficulty together, and the house that had once echoed with Ethan's lonely exhaustion now filled instead with laughter, with the sound of Margaret singing while she worked, with Noah's growing confidence as he learned the ways of the land under both his parents' patient guidance. Margaret never tried to replace Clara in Noah's heart, but instead helped him hold both loves, the mother he had lost too young to remember fully, and the woman who had chosen to love him as her own, teaching him that a heart could hold more than one kind of love without diminishing either. 2 years after their wedding, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, and watching Noah cradle his baby sister with such gentle wonder brought Ethan to tears he didn't try to hide. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, and the house that had once felt so empty now rang constantly with life, with the ordinary blessed chaos of a family finally whole. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Ethan would think back to that autumn day outside the general store, when 15 years of separation had dissolved in an instant at the sight of Margaret's face, and he would marvel at how life had brought them back to each other, how grief and loss had somehow paved the way for a love deeper and more resilient than either of them could have imagined in their youth. He had learned, in the hardest way possible, that love lost was not always love ended, that sometimes the universe simply asked for patience, for the wisdom that only pain could teach, before it delivered you back to where you were always meant to be. And on evenings when the whole family gathered on the porch to watch the sun set gold over the mountains, Noah growing tall and steady beside them, little Grace giggling in her mother's arms, Ethan would reach for Margaret's hand and think that no man had ever been more blessed, that no home had ever been more truly earned, than the one they had built together out of second chances and enduring, unshakable love.